Welcome, everybody. Indeed, this is fantastic. We were so thrilled with this to start this series with Sally. And Sally's an old friend of or not old, sorry, she's a good friend of Fowler's. So after a career in education, she completed an MA in garden history at Birkbeck and has continued to research aspects of garden history for a number of projects. Her particular interest is in the 20th century landscape, and her MA dissertation considered the design of memorial parks and gardens in the post-war era. She studied the work of Geoffrey Jellicoe when investigating his design for the roof garden at Harvey's department store in Guildford, and discovered then Susan Jellicoe's photograph albums in the archive at the Landscape Institute. And she's continued to explore this fascinating collection of over 6,000 images now at the Merle and its significance in the history of post-war urban landscape. She's a member of the Sussex Gardens Trust and edited their most recent publication, Geoffrey Jellicoe in Sussex, a collection of research studies examining Jellicoe's commissions in the county. She researches and writes articles for the SGT journal and publishes a monthly newsletter on their website. And Sally, I can't tell you how much we're looking forward to this. So thank you very, very much indeed, and good luck.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'd like to start by setting the context, the world that Susan Jellicoe found herself in when she joined the recently formed Institute of Landscape Architects in the early 1930s. Because although this talk is about the archive of photographs that she left to the Institute, it is a collection of images filtered through the preoccupations of this group of landscape architects in the post-war period. Now, I apologise for the really poor quality of this slide. I wouldn't normally use a slide like this, but it is significant, not only for introducing the founder members of the Institute. So here we have Geoffrey Jellicoe, this is Richard Sudell, and this is Russell Page. And here at the front is Marjorie Allen, and this is Susan Jellicoe. The Landscape Institute was formed after a conversation between Richard Sudell and Geoffrey Jellicoe, Marjorie Allen and Brenda Colvin, and formed in 1929. And their purpose really was to ensure that the planning of landscape design could influence the planning of new towns in the post-war period. And they wanted to disseminate their ideas more widely with the public. So using a photograph, using exhibitions, using displays of photographs was a key way to do this. And this photograph was taken at their first exhibition, that's what it was called, which was held in Broadway in Warwickshire, and it was at the showrooms of Gordon Russell, who was a furniture designer and a friend of Geoffrey Jellicoe's. And it consisted of 57 photographs, 2 models and a historical section. And it was reported on by Susan Jellicoe for their journal at the time, which was called Landscape and Garden. Now, at the time, Landscape and Garden only had colour illustrations and cover designs by artists like John Piper and Paul Nash. And so an exhibition of photographs of recent work was important to promote this new role. After the war, the journal reappeared as the Journal of the Institute of Landscape Architects, with a plain cover and illustrations up until 1948, when the first photographs started to appear. This would have been one of Susan Jellicoe's first projects, because she had only recently joined the Institute in the early 1930s, when she answered an advertisement from Geoffrey Jellicoe for a secretary. She joined then and married Geoffrey Jellicoe in 1936, and he commented on Susan Jellicoe that she was very high-powered and intellectual and interested in the arts. So for her article that she wrote at this time for the journal, she commented on this wide range of work that the architects were producing. So here is a roof garden by Marjorie Allen. This was for a nursery school in London. And then a more traditional and more extensive project was Memorial by Gilbert White at Stoke Poges. And then this small private garden by Sylvia Crowe at Potter's Bar. It was really the interests, I think, and the qualities that Susan Jellicoe had, particularly interested in art and in culture and in events that were happening around her, that I think led to her set of activities within the Institute. Networking with artists and designers and architects, exhibition organising to promote their work, editing and publication, and photography, which will be the particular focus of this talk. Joining the Institute, she became part of a group of intelligent, well-educated and aspirational women. Of different backgrounds, Sylvia Crowe and Brenda Colvin had both been students at Swanley College, and Marjorie Allen, although calling herself an uneducated lady, nevertheless had many friends in the wider world of art and publishing. And together, they shared a concern for the planning of the land, as Allen said, to be used and enjoyed by all people. It was a new role for this group of women, and they quickly gained skills for larger projects as they found opportunities to influence the public landscapes of housing, industry, factories, workplaces, and even playgrounds. Without a formal training in landscape architecture, Susan became a key player, much admired and valued by her colleagues, and her early life experiences shaped the later direction of her career. She was born Ursula Pares, although she liked to be known as Sue, and she was the third child of Sir Bernard Pares, an academic, an esteemed professor of Russian at King's College in London. Her mother, Margaret, was a suffragette. She went on the suffragettes' marches, and she became the secretary of the Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, which took the place of the early suffragette movement. When she was 11, her parents separated, and she moved with her mother to West Kirby, and then in 1920, she went to live with her maternal grandparents in Hampstead. As a young woman, she travelled to Italy and to Germany, learning languages. She took singing lessons in Vienna and spent a term at the Sorbonne studying languages there, possibly at the same time as Simone de Beauvoir. And she joined an archaeological dig in Jericho. When the war broke out, Susan was now serving at the Ministry of Information, formed after the declaration of war, to develop publicity and propaganda to sustain morale. And one of her roles was to analyse aerial photography. Significantly, she met the people who would be involved in producing photographs and posters, films and displays, and arranging exhibitions to promote the war effort. And this was headed by the graphic designer Milner Gray, who would go on to work for the Festival of Britain, and architects like Frederick Gibbard, who was a friend and a neighbour of the Jellicoes. In 1945, she became the press officer for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. This was helping displaced persons to return to their homes across Europe, founded in 1943. And for a time, she served at the agency's displaced persons camp in Germany, employing all her linguistic and social skills. 100,000 displaced persons were in 400 camps across Germany, with up to 9 different languages being spoken. This field of expertise she successfully brought to the Institute, and these experiences made her such a valued member. When the International Federation of Landscape Architects was launched in 1948, her linguistic skills were so helpful to the Institute, and Sylvia Crowe wrote that her outgoing personality created friendship and understanding between nations that had been separated by 5 years of war. Developing successful networks, especially those in the visual and the creative world. I'll just go forward a moment. Between artists and designers and architects was important to promote the work of the Institute. She began writing and editing articles for the journal in 1955, and a key part of her role became organising exhibitions. As a means of mass communication, exhibitions, of course, were eventually replaced by television, but important during the war and for a short time afterwards to present and celebrate the work of landscape architects and designers. In fact, Susan's exhibition planning role began before the war, an exhibition in Brussels in 1935, and then in London, this exhibition, Garden and Landscape, an exhibition of the work of the landscape architect held in London in June 1939. It was created by the garden designer Christopher Tunnard, but arranged by Susan to show how the profession managed what were called special problems, such as the gardens for housing estates, play parks, holiday camps, and street planting. You can see here one of the placards that she created, which then had large photographs and items on them. This particular one, the man-made landscape, but it was really showing how landscape architects would be involved in the landscape with new materials. And you might not be able to read these, but it's stone, brick, and concrete. Concrete features a great deal at this time. And then following her experiences in the Ministry of Information, where she would have come into contact with far more people who were planning exhibitions and displays, she went to and reported on and took photographs of this exhibition in Brussels. This was the Expo in 1958. There was a travelling exhibition in London called Landscape for Living, which in the early 1960s, premise had been that landscape had been disregarded in work, industry, and education. And then in 1963, she reported on and photographed this International Garden exhibition in Hamburg. And networking was important within their own lives at their home in Grove Terrace in Highgate. Her niece, Susan Pares, also Susan, recalled her aunt as being lively, sophisticated, and interested in everything. She was always well dressed and stylish, and she took a strong role in her niece's education, introducing them to painting, theatre, ballet, and the opera. Anyone who visited them in their North London home remarks on the laughter, the stimulating conversation, and in rooms that were furnished with pictures and books. The Jellicoes supported and promoted the work of young garden designers too. John Brooks, for example, acknowledged their role in introducing him to London. This was a young man from Durham. And on one occasion at their home, they introduced him to their hero, the Brazilian landscape designer Roberto Burle Marx, who of course went on to become such an influence in John Brooks's own designs. Their home was furnished in a contemporary and modernist style, and they were inspired by modern abstract art. Their collection and their address book included work by people like Picasso, Paul Hitchens, Barbara Hepworth, and Ben Nicholson, who became a lifelong friend. The influence of such artists as Paul Klee upon Geoffrey Jellicoe has been really well recorded. He made the comment that when he first went into Frederick Gibbard's home in Highgate, he saw for the first time abstract art on the walls of Gibbard's room and just couldn't believe it. He couldn't make out what all these scribbles, as he described it, were doing. But eventually, after seeing more and talking to Gibbard, he was really taken. He said it was like being struck by lightning to be taken up by modern art. And it influenced a great deal of his work. People like Paul Klee, for example, is well known for influencing designs such as at Hemel and the Water Garden. But I wonder too how much of this influence came from Susan, with her cosmopolitan and European background, her interest in the arts. We know that she collected paintings herself, and this is one. This is by Graham Sutherland. It was a study for a huge mural at the Festival of Britain called The Origins of the Land, abstract design to show the makeup of the layers of the land in this country. It wasn't apparently very much liked, but in some ways I think that shows how ahead of their times in many ways the Jellicoes were to be purchasing art that perhaps still was received quite negatively by the majority of people. Susan photographed their garden at Grove Terrace over 5 decades. She designed the garden as well, and she was a skilled plantswoman, going on to design nearly all of the planting designs for Geoffrey Jellicoe's projects. It's well known that he said that he really had no regard for plants at all and no interest in them. The Hemel water gardens might have been one of the first that she designed for him, and she carried on until the very last project. This was very influenced by their visit to Stockholm. Shortly after the war, they went to Stockholm on an international conference. And although her planting here in her notes and in her drawings that you can see there, although it's following many of the plants that she recommended for small town gardens, plants like rhododendron and viburnum, magnolia, and lavender, the differing heights and the range of colour in the planting design owes much to the Swedish influence for planting in wide drifts and contrasting colours to create a natural sense of landscape. The Hemel project was photographed through stages of design and redesign. It was a long process, and these photographs make a valuable record of the working process. The collection that was titled Own Work was for record and publicity and promoting the Institute's work through the journal and through the exhibitions. And it illustrates in many ways the commitment to the photograph in telling a story effectively, perhaps exemplified in the late 1950s when the Institute Journal requested that members send in slides to create a visual library and the use of photographs to illustrate work in progress. Now, whether in some dusty cupboard somewhere all of these slides and photographs are still existing, I have no idea, but it would be interesting to see what was sent in at the time. At the Institute, Allen, Crowe and Colvin, and later Nan Fairbrother, were all realising the influence of photography to increase knowledge with the public. They pictured the landscape of new lives in a changing society. Urban areas, motorways, power stations, all of landscape mattered. The photograph could be powerful in conveying new ways to think about outdoor areas and the design of open spaces that are neither parks nor gardens, as in Nan Fairbrother's image here of Stevenage Newtown, with its mixture of new materials, stone, railings, concrete. It's not a park, it's not a garden, but it's an urban town. The camera could bear witness to these changes. Just like gardening, Susan Jellicoe taught herself photography. According to Geoffrey Jellicoe, the collection of over 6,000 photographs began with the visit to Stockholm after the war. Geoffrey Jellicoe remembered bringing home to an art-starved Britain, he said, a feast of photographs of modern landscape architecture. It could be said that photography and architecture were made for each other, and more versatile cameras, as they developed through the 1930s, encouraged experimentation, close-ups, possibilities from different perspectives, and having to point the camera skywards for high-rise buildings. Aerial photography, of which Susan had experience during the war, also offered new viewpoints, and magazines like the Architectural Review exploited this technology. Members of the Institute recognised that she was an accomplished photographer, her care for composition, her use of contrast and framing. For their book, The Landscape of Man, which they wrote jointly and published in 1964 and then republished, Geoffrey Jellicoe wrote that from 1958 to 1975, they went to the ends of the earth. The only serious failure was not getting into China, photographing. And we could take a world tour through these photographs. They are amongst her most striking and emotionally responsive, I think, to the landscape. But I would rather focus on the significance of her work in picturing the post-war landscape in this country. Sylvia Crowe wrote that the Institute was committed to making a better world. And I think this archive captures something of their endeavour. These small, square format photographs, or contact prints, painstakingly pasted by Jellicoe in a tight grid on sheets of brown paper and hand-labelled, construct a visual diary of the period. Uniting this collection is a commitment to the impact of landscape design on ordinary lives. From over 6,000 images, I've selected a small group of 4 designs, which I think encapsulates the mid-20th century. This is Hemel, the Hemel Water Gardens, and this was a new kind of public park in an urban area. Strongly influenced by their visit to Stockholm, when the journal wrote, "The Swedish park system is a stage for an open life to be enjoyed by every type of citizen." Her images portray this idea of a setting. There are office workers taking lunch. There are young women strolling together. There are office workers with their friends. There are women with children. And it's the setting for a way of life in which one can walk or stroll or picnic. She created the flower planting, as I said, for Hemel, and a few years ago it was restored using her photographs and her drawings and her plans. This is a grade 2 listed site now as well. And you can see how they followed the same way of creating these drifts of planting and masses of colour throughout. Post-war design was clearly influenced by science and discovery. The buildings for the Festival of Britain, for example, were described as new, strange, stimulating, and full of half-revealed possibilities. Modern materials like concrete and gravel and fiberglass could enable these abstract shapes that you can see here of the planting patterns. Jellicoe wrote that after the war, the concept of landscape design emerged from obscurity to create a vital profession. And architects like Frederick Gibbard were convinced that Britain should be a better place to live in. I think this huge sense of optimism is epitomised in the Sky Garden, created on the roof of a department store in 1956, at a time when Sputnik first spun around the Earth. And it was to be a garden full of surprise and the unexpected. You can see the amoeba shapes and the curving lines of the planting. Done it again. Right. The viewing platforms from the terraces here, and the cafes, and here the circles of stepping stones across the water create an image as if seen from space. And here the parasols and the cafes echo perhaps themes from the Festival of Britain, or maybe from the Jellicoe's visit to Stockholm. Here is a cafe, this is at Slussen, an outdoor cafe with this striped parasols, quite reminiscent of what he would then use at the roof garden. The roof garden featured in the Architectural Review of 1957, when Geoffrey Jellicoe wrote that the water is intended to mirror the sky. The circles embody the idea of planets spinning through space. And Susan Jellicoe's photographs with the article and the caption, "Here is a test of courage, a river that flows into the sky, crossed only by stepping stones floating on water. Will they carry you over or off the edge to eternity?" The planting by Susan Jellicoe included iris and primulas, astilbes, hostas and ferns, and water-loving plants which were popular at the time for a natural garden. It was restored a number of years ago now. It went through a very neglected period. It was the cafe and the and being open to the public kind of ended, I think, towards the end of the 1960s. And then it was completely neglected and then nobody was allowed to go on it. And then it was restored carefully, very carefully, with different hard materials that you can see how the rush, they were kind of bamboo screens and they were replaced by metal screens. When it was first there in the 1960s, apparently there were quite a few problems. I mean, that's where a photograph can sometimes deceive the eyes, because it didn't all work out perfectly. The engineering for the water, which was meant to flow over the edge and then recirculate, didn't quite work out and took some sorting to get that working. And then small boys took a great deal of pleasure in throwing things off the edge down onto the street below. So I think more barricades were put up. But then, as I say, it was restored a few years ago, and it was there until 2 years ago, I think 2 years ago. Unfortunately, the department store has closed down. But the garden itself, the roof garden, is listed, so something will have to happen with the roof garden to preserve it. Now, Jellicoe said that the roof garden was really a place of play. And in this large public square, this was for Plymouth around the same time, he said that the scheme had to have dignity and frivolity. So there was a mixture here of hard landscaping with a variety of different materials, granite and pebbles and Plymouth limestone. But you can see from her photographs here that she's shown how, again, how people will use this space. So the seating around the trees, this was around existing trees, kind of almost circular, and sometimes left so that it would look off centre. And Jellicoe said that this was so that it was a hoopla swing to the seating. And landscape architects were involved with how people would connect in these spaces, taking time out from shopping to relax within a town or a city rather than in a public park. This is in the process of being renovated. So you can see here the curves of the original planting and the seating around the trees. The hard landscaping here on the surface doesn't look quite the same to me as it was, but at least it is still being cared for. Now, this I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. This is the Kennedy Memorial at Runnymede, created in 1965 after the assassination of President Kennedy. And it has been written about and researched by Annabelle, who has done some fascinating exploration, particularly of its connection with America. And she has spoken about this at least twice. So I don't want to try to match that in any way. I've chosen it for a different reason, really. I've chosen it because I think it's an example of minimalist and perhaps even modernist planting style. Geoffrey Jellicoe was asked, apparently, where are all the flower beds for a memorial site? To which he said, there is no compromise of neatly cut grass and trim flower beds. The Kennedy Memorial is rich in allegory and symbolism, in which flower borders would be absent. Actually, Susan Jellicoe did design planting for it, but it was a very natural and very subdued planting to fit in with the existing woodland. It's a pathway. It's based on the Pilgrim's Progress and the idea of 60,000 granite sets that were all hand cut quite differently from one another, represent individuals or pilgrims making their way up through the darkness of the wood to the memorial. Jellicoe told the stonemason not to lay them methodically, you can see here in Susan's photograph, but like crowds at a football match, climbing upwards through the ash trees and the rhododendrons and emerging into the light. Here's the memorial stone, and this single tree is an American scarlet oak, chosen because in November, at the end of November, the leaves turn red and fall to the ground, symbolizing Kennedy's death. He was assassinated on the 22nd of November. But it's, to me, very like the planting of a spare modernist garden. And I noticed that Susan tried to frame this tree in several ways. There are several photographs that she took where she's isolated the tree, trying to silhouette and to frame it against the woodland. And this was something that photographers who were capturing modernist gardens at the time, particularly those out in America and in California, often tried to do. There would be blank, hardly any planting, just a few modern tubular chairs, long sweep of landscape, perhaps a swimming pool, and then against the skyline would be the single tree. So she seems to capture something of that essence, I think. It is a listed site. It's a most beautiful site to go to and visit. Here's the tree now growing into maturity. So to just sum up that section, the subjects, I think, in her collection framed what mattered to the Institute. You can see here, this is landscaping for the sewage works by Sheila Hayward, shopping centre by Jellicoe, which has a garden centre within. Car parks. There's a whole section in Susan Jellicoe's collection of car park photographs, and obviously taken because how would you deal with this growing increase in cars and still keep a natural landscape? And here's the LCC housing at Roehampton. Oh, why does this keep Right. It's just trying to stress me out. I'm not having it. All right. From the serious to the more playful, I want to take a sideways glimpse into what was actually one of the largest sections in her collection, and that was titled Children's Play. It was Marjorie Allen who led the campaign for the adventure playground movement in this country after her visit to a junk playground in Denmark. And Marjorie Allen is going to be the subject of another talk in this series, so I'm not going to go into any depth about the history of this movement. I'm really looking forward to this because she was such an inspirational leader, I think, for what happens to children and their play. And it was pioneering work that she did. But what interests me about these photographs, which we know were taken before 1953, is that they are not picturing Jellicoe's work or part of their journeys together, but seem to express her own interests and concerns. We don't know exactly when the photographs were taken. Marjorie Allen visited the junk playgrounds in Denmark in 1946, so it's possible that Susan went with her. But one of the frustrating things about this collection is that they are not dated. Hardly any of the photographs are dated. And for somebody so meticulous and careful as Susan, I find it quite amazing that she couldn't have just put a few dates here and there. Further research might show when she went. Some of the photographs appeared in journals around 1953, so we know that it was before that time. And I wonder how much this was a result of working in the displaced persons camps in Germany and what she would have witnessed after the war. Because we use this phrase, displaced persons, this is what the administration was called, but we're talking about people. And primarily, we're talking about women, we're talking about mothers, and we're talking about children without a home and without a place to play. One of the Jellicoe's friends, an American woman called Katie Lachheim, she too worked in one of the camps in Germany at the same time. Whether it was the same one, I don't know. And she wrote afterwards that in the camp that she was in, there were 7,000 displaced people, the large number of whom were deserted children. So I wonder if this is what influenced Susan's desire to go and look at these playgrounds in Denmark and then to create quite a collection of photographs. The photographs portray the junk, the discarded materials that filled these playgrounds and fulfilled the philosophy that spontaneous and creative play would come from children themselves, free from the restraints of conventional playground equipment. Here is the Park Hill Adventure Playground in Camden in the 1950s. And here she's photographed the beginnings of experimental architecture that the children have made themselves. The play leader, Jack Lambert, described this as a precarious building made from wooden poles, towers above the playground. It's a high-rise lookout. Another playground that she photographed was this one in Birmingham, designed by the imaginative landscape architect Mary Mitchell, a friend and colleague of Susan's, who will also feature in this 20th century landscape architect series. Mitchell worked with sculptors such as John Bridgman, who were aiming to bring art into playgrounds with abstract forms, as Bridgman said, to make art tactile and bring sculpture out of the stuffy museum and into the sunshine. Here is his Flight sculpture, which featured on the cover of the Journal of the Institute of Landscape Architects. Some of these pieces of architecture have just disappeared, but there is now more attention to these playgrounds and particularly to their sculpture, and some are now being preserved. But in practice at the time, the design of play equipment changed to become more realistic than abstract, with space rockets or pirate ships, perhaps affected by changing perceptions of finance and risk to health and even discipline, I think. But it's interesting to see that there is a renewed interest in freer spaces of play. And these photographs become a valuable archive, really, in sharing our knowledge of an unpretentious open space. Right, for the last section, I want to look at how she pictured the modern garden. The extent to which a truly modernist approach to garden design in this country is really a subject for another debate. But this is the the Roundhouse at St Anne's Hill in Chertsey in Surrey, 1936, and it's very often quoted and appears in books as an example of a modern house and a modern garden. These are Susan Jellicoe's photographs. They were used in several journals and books and continue to do so. This was designed by Christopher Tunnard in conjunction with the Australian architect Raymond McGrath. And Raymond McGrath said that this house was like a big round cheese with a slice cut out. Christopher Tunnard designed the garden. It has a roof garden that you can see here. There was a piece of modern sculpture, and of course it made use of modern materials, particularly concrete again. Tunnard's concept of the social landscape proposed that gardens should be communal, belonging to all, so that everyone could reach schools and shops and work and connect to the countryside. A garden without limitation would mean, of course, the abolition of large private gardens and minimum gardens for families as a compromise. This was partly adapted for Harlow Newtown, where green wedges, as they were called, were designed so that the landscape would extend out from the town centre into the countryside surrounding. Christopher Tunnard, I think, was quite right in what he said, that the modern house requires modern surroundings, but it's arguable how much that was really ever taken up. But in 1968, Geoffrey and Susan Jellicoe published jointly Modern Private Gardens. And this was 40 gardens from across the world, illustrated with 130 black and white photographs, many of which were taken by Susan. And this book can really be read as an experimentation with contemporary materials and minimal landscapes, with sinuous shapes and geometric forms, with the inclusion of modern art and sculpture into garden, which was quite unusual at that time. And the pages featured some of the gardens of their friends and colleagues, including Frederick Gibbard. There were also gardens from America and Europe. It was quite a groundbreaking design book at its time. Even the format, it's a sort of oblong shape. And then these striking photographs fill each of the pages. One of the other young garden designers who featured here was John Brooks. He had just come from his success as a young man from the Chelsea Flower Show with his design there in 1962, and two of his gardens featured in the Jellicoe's book. This is at Harmondsworth, and this garden had, again, concrete slabs, but designed in a Mondrian-type pattern, which Brooks would then go on to use in many of his garden designs following. So you can see this sort of low grid section even repeated in the building. They also featured the home of Frederick Gibbard. This is at Harlow, where he'd gone in 1956 after he'd been appointed master planner of Harlow Newtown 10 years earlier. And the photographs taken by Susan here, I think, portray the garden as a series of spaces attached to the house. So she photographed these enclosed wall gardens as this seen from the sitting room. Gibbard was keen on sculpture, but reformed sculpture made from found objects. He even imported some discarded huge columns from Coutts Bank in London and then had them transported to his garden in Harlow and made into different kinds of sculpture. Here's a picture more recently of Gibbard's garden. So you can see some of these structures that he's made from different materials, and the hard materials in the landscaping of the garden, which were pebbles and again concrete. These steps were photographed by Susan and featured in a journal called Concrete Quarterly. These are still here in the garden, and the garden's open to the public, I think, at different times of the year. In Modern Private Gardens, Geoffrey Jellicoe wrote, "There are no longer a few great gardens, but countless small gardens, vital as extensions to our cramped living spaces." And in fact, this was a theme that had appeared far earlier in a joint publication written by Susan Jellicoe and Marjorie Allen. This was the Things We See series. This was published by Penguin, instigated by the Board of Trade, in fact, to try to promote British design. heavily reliant on photographs, which were meant to sort of portray in some ways what was meant to be seen as good taste. And there were other books in the series, one on houses, one on furniture, and this was the last one in the series, Gardens. They were small, almost square paperbacks, and they cost 5 shillings. It's quite an innovation in design in some ways, in the books themselves. So photography created the narrative, really, in catching good taste. Alan and Jellicoe described it as a picture book of gardens. And they're gardens which begin with indoor gardens, window boxes, balconies, and then move out to the town and places of work and leisure. They include playgrounds, they end with cemeteries. Unlike contemporary garden literature, this was not a how-to manual of horticultural advice, but posed questions such as how the garden might be used, particularly by children. They suggest at one point that the ugliness of school playgrounds needs a book to itself, which I distinctly hear Marjorie Allen's voice behind. And they were influenced very much by the Swedish park system, where children's playgrounds were created in every park. The garden space might only be a balcony, but with the use of modern and affordable materials, it could provide a place of relaxation. And I think it's important to see this publication in context. It was published shortly after areas of London and other cities had been almost completely devastated by bombing, and the desire to rebuild a sense of community was reflected in the preoccupation with creating environments to be enjoyed and put to use by the whole family. Jellicoe created a section for the Festival of Britain, which was called the Living Exhibition of Housing. And these were to be permanent houses, but created in the East End of London on the area known as Poplar, and then renamed as the Lansbury Estate. And the idea, as you can see in this poster for the Festival of Britain of the time, was that new homes would rise from London's ruins. It would go on to influence some of the new towns like Harlow, and Jellicoe instigated here, in this drawing that you can see here, there were a mix of housing styles. So there were 3-storey houses, maisonettes, and ground floor bed sits, and they were created around 2 small squares which acted like village greens. The idea really behind the Festival of Britain building was to have neighbourhoods so that there would be this sense of community. In some ways it was moving forwards and terribly modern, and yet in other ways it went back to the past. Each had a small garden that was designed by Susan Jellicoe, which you can see here, which featured in Things We See. These were really tiny back gardens that she created. Again, paving stones here of concrete could be taken up and moved to change the planting pattern. And she said that the diagonal washing line in this garden on an axis really created the design, because she wanted it to so that the housewife would not need to step on the flower beds. Now, this might seem a bit parochial to us now, and of course gender roles were unquestioned really, but it's nevertheless, I think, the impact of small space on the garden that still needed to perform its functions. Interestingly, just as an aside, the washing line was quite important in a number of designs at that time, in communal living, for example, and there are some lovely, lovely pictures, which I haven't got time to sort out and show you, from this collection, where she photographed one of the estates in London where there were communal washing lines and beautiful posts that were designed with finials at the top in all sorts of creatures and birds. I think that somebody could write a thesis quite easily on washing lines. Marjorie Allen said of Things We See, it was a delightful assignment, and they had enjoyed the collaboration so much that 3 years later they produced another joint book, The New Small Garden. They searched out small gardens. As Allen said, some of these were not not imaginary gardens, but real gardens. And of the 32 chosen, they were illustrated with Susan Jellicoe's photographs, and many of them were designed by their colleagues or by their artist friends. So in this book, the private garden really becomes a testing ground of ideas, the starting point for possibilities of the small garden in the future. the small garden still had to accommodate an atmosphere of mystery and illusion. It might just be a patio garden in Chelsea, but could it also bring in a sense of art? Here it's an extension of the dining room, and the coloured tiles, because we don't know what colour they are, were by the artist Peggy Angus. Or it might be an office garden, here designed by Colvin and Crowe, and with the quote that they add, rather than being sat in, it could be looked at, but still involving nature and natural surroundings within a tiny garden. It might be a pocket handkerchief, like this garden in Sloane Square, but still with seating, or a space for children in this garden at St John's Wood, designed by Brenda Colvin. The garden could be an additional room without its ceiling, they wrote, and as outdoor spaces were becoming really roofless extensions of the house, the garden had to be somewhere to retire from the world. It still had to be a home in the garden, as they wrote, an additional room without a ceiling, a room outside. This phrase, the room outside, of course, became the title of a now renowned book in 1969 by John Brooks, a theme conveyed by illustrations, a few of which now were in bright Kodak colour, from America or European modernist sources, and echoing the authors of the new small garden. He said, "A garden is fundamentally a place for use by people. The garden is no longer a set piece," he said, "for showing off plants." Ideas and innovations in the design of the post-war landscape are communicated by all kinds of visual representation. Architectural plans, drawings, maps, photographs, and models. This is Susan and Geoffrey working on a model possibly for the Hemel Water Gardens. All reveal the ideology that shaped the open spaces of the mid-20th century. Susan Jellicoe's collection of small black and white photographs taken during the 1950s and 60s show telling fragments of the post-war landscape, captured and assembled by a curious, well-travelled and distinctly modern eye, and remain a powerful testament to her life. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. I'm glad we got over the few slip-ups at the beginning. I think we're able to take any questions in the chat box if anyone has anything.
Sally, thank you so much. That was gripping stuff and beautifully illustrated. I didn't notice any slip-ups at all.
Can I just say the database of all these photographs is on the website, the Merle website, and you can go into them, you can look at them close up, all of them. So great stuff. I'll just stop sharing now.
One of the things that struck me very much about that wonderful talk was the fact that you spoke for, and I wish I'd timed you now, considerable length of time without mentioning Geoffrey Jellicoe, except in the sense of the fact that she applied for a job with him and she married him. And that when I realised that, I was quite surprised and quite shocked that I think that must be actually a very rare thing to have done, that you took Susan in her own right and as an individual. And I would personally like to thank you very, very much for doing that. Can I kick off the questions while people have time to... I know we've got a question and a comment there already, and I will come to them, I promise. Yes, they're coming in now. But I would just like to ask, the received wisdom that I've heard occasionally is that Susan concentrated her skills and her attributes around Geoffrey's skills and attributes and activities. Was it that consciously that she developed her photography and her planting, or was it simply because that's what she was interested in and it did complement what her husband was doing?
Yeah, good point. It's hard to tell because when you read things by Geoffrey Jellicoe, it's very much that, particularly the photography said, started because of their trip to Stockholm, and that's where the interest came from. In talking to other people, I talked quite a long time ago now to Susan Pares, their niece. she felt that Susan deliberately sort of kept herself in the background and in the shadow of Geoffrey Jellicoe's work, and that she was pleased to do that. It wasn't something that she felt she was being asked to do. So there's a sort of balance, I think, between listening to him and thinking that that's how these interests came about. I think, I think her experiences before she met him, and then particularly during the war, and the kind of people that she would have been exposed to. For example, in the Ministry of Information, she would have been exposed to people taking photographs. She would have read journals like the Architectural Review and seen the work that photographers were doing for modern landscapes. So I think there is a part that came from her own interests there. I have read that she said herself she didn't know very much about planting until she began working with Geoffrey, and then she began to realize how important it was. She wasn't somebody, from what I can gather, to necessarily put herself forward. I think she was someone, and yet she was assured and confident. If I could go backwards, but I'm not going to risk losing everything again. That photograph of them at the first exhibition is an interesting one, because in the photograph, considering it was at an exhibition where they wanted to draw attention to photographic work, half the group are looking somewhere else and not at the photographer. They all look, especially the men, a bit shady with their hands in their pockets, as though, what am I doing here? Marjorie Allen is looking way off on another direction. She is the only one who knows how to address the camera. She stood full on, square facing, and ready to do what the camera wants her to do. So I think there was more self-awareness than she sometimes allowed herself to be credited for.
I think I would definitely agree with that view, because when you look at the photographs before, when she's working, as you say, her war work, her photographs, and her she was press officer, was she?
Press officer, yeah.
You see a woman there who knows what she's doing, is assured, is not feeling intimidated or dominated by anybody.
No, not at all,
She's
no.
playing her part, and I felt those early photographs were extremely important in assessing her role and her work in later years. I thank you, Virginia, for your comment about the water garden, the roof garden didn't leak. I think
No, it didn't.
that you mentioned science and discovery informing landscape. Well, obviously that was something that was taken up there in creating a non-leaking water garden. So thank you, Virginia, for that. And on the same topic, Sarah, you asked, was it the owners of the department store itself who commissioned the roof garden in Guildford? And was there a connection with Jellicoe?
That's interesting. I don't know. I don't know how it came about that he was asked to do that. I would have to look into that a bit more to find out. Yeah.
And so it goes on, noticing the planting plan illustration relating to Lansbury. Are there more examples of her drawing illustrations as well as photographs?
There aren't, unfortunately. Hemel is about the only site where her planting list and drawings still remain. There are very few others. There's a small amount for the roof garden, which are in, well, I think they're still with the Landscape Institute. I think that's where I would have seen them before. But the others, there's very little that remains. I mean, we know that from his notes and his recording that she was involved with several other projects, but the plans don't seem to have lasted.
Can I actually, Annabelle, are you there? Because you also mentioned slides and photographs in an archive somewhere. Annabelle, can you shed any light on that? And as ex-Landscape Institute archivist, are you willing to contribute anything on that one?
There are some of her drawings in connection with Sutton Place, her planting plans, which are at Merle. So that was part of it. I'm sorry, what was the first part? I was looking up who was the client for the roof garden, and I missed your first bit of the question. It was Army and Navy stores. So whether
All right.
long gone, haven't they? They were
Yes,
swallowed up by
yes,
Razor or something or other.
yeah.
Sorry, what was your part of the question, Helen? Sorry.
I was really just in any other archives and stores that we know of that have got Susan's documents or photographs that you might be aware of that perhaps the rest of us aren't.
Well, the Hemel ones are all at the Hertfordshire. It is Hertfordshire, isn't it? At the record office there.
Yeah. I'm sure Sally knows about all those. I just want.
I had forgotten that, but they are, yes, because I remember looking
Yeah.
at them there. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I think there are very few apart from Sutton Place, and there's quite a lot on Sutton Place. But it was then sort of I'm not a handwriting expert, but so there were other people involved, and I've forgotten the architects who came from Arabs, who Charles Funke knew and set up to take somebody in MacDonald to take over the works and implement it all. So they were liaising with her. So there's some quite interesting stuff there as well.
Thanks, Annabelle. Sorry to
Okay.
put that one on you rather rapidly. Gwendolyn says, absolutely wonderful, Sally, as I think we all are. She says, you must come and see photos here. John collaborated with Marjorie Allen on a children's playground book, and I wonder if the photos were Susan's. Are you able to comment on that?
There's the book Planning for Play, which Marjorie Allen wrote, and there are some of Susan Jellicoe's photographs in that book. And then they collaborated together on two books, the Modern Small Garden, and I think it was called Town Gardens to Live In. And then the Things We See series has a couple of books of children's playgrounds, one of which is taken by Susan, but the others are taken by other people.
Okay.
It was a strong, this children's play part was a strong collaboration between the two. And I've looked, I mean, when we come to talk, when we have our speaker on Marjorie Allen, she might be able to throw more light on this. I have looked at some of Marjorie Allen's archives, and read her biography, but I couldn't find, apart from commenting about how much she liked working on the book, there's very little else that Marjorie Allen, that I've found, says about Susan Jellicoe.
Gwendolyn, I don't know whether you want to expand on that question or whether you're happy to stay quiet, but you're very welcome to expand on that if you'd like to.
I won't elaborate on it, but I do think that we have some of her black and white photos in our soon to become archive here at Denman's Garden, and I'd love you to come see those.
That would be great. That would be fantastic. I'd love to.
Another Adrian says, totally brilliant. Thank you. Outstanding woman. I'm not sure if that's Susan or you, Sally, probably better. And your work. So it obviously is.
I'm only the messenger. The work is Susan's, definitely. I think that and this series of talks will show this. The networking is a really interesting aspect, isn't it? Why this group of women, and there were others. I think Nan Fairbrother is somebody who's been overlooked and could deserve a real treatment now. And what brought them together at that time. And we know about other networks of artists. We know about the Bloomsbury Group and cultural networks, but I don't think anyone's looked at landscape architects of this period who must have really fed off each other, I think.
So now there's another PhD thesis on the making. Please take note of that one. Annie and Debbie, it seems like Jellicoe's early use of aerial photography is echoed in the current use of LiDAR aerial surveys in historic gardens and estates. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, an interesting point. It's certainly developed, hasn't it? Aerial photography now has got all sorts of techniques that it wouldn't have had in those days when it would have been quite simple to do. It's another instance where I think this time in the Ministry of Information, it's a shame we don't know more about it in a way, because I do think it must have had a big influence. She'd come from having I think she'd worked at one of the London banks, so it was that kind of background, and then being in a completely different environment and being exposed to quite a lot of different techniques and strategies that were going on, like aerial photography, and certainly journals at the time were reproducing aerial photographs, which must have opened up her opportunities for what you can do with a camera.
But she obviously also had a brain that could assimilate all this diverse information from science through to art. Is that a fair comment, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think she came from, didn't she? Came from a very intellectual, highly educated family. And I know somebody else has done a bit of background research into the family, and it goes back through people having sort of academic roles. So she'd grown up in that family as well. And then, of course, choosing to go and travel when you're quite young, late 1920s when she was doing that. Even that's quite an astounding thing to do, isn't it? It shows a lot of confidence, a lot of self-confidence.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. She's, I don't know, one tends to think of that as being unusual. Perhaps we're misinformed, but she certainly pioneered, I think, many things. Sarah Dickinson, I don't know whether you want to come back. You say you were thinking about the books, etc., which she was writing. I presume this is referring to your interest in her illustrations and photos.
Yeah, that's right, Helen. To clarify, I was just really interested that she'd used drawn illustration alongside a photograph, and I just wondered if you'd seen other examples of that. Not so much her actual planting plans, which I know is very few and far between.
Oh, right. Was that the drawn illustration with the Lansbury garden?
That's correct. Yeah.
I put those two things together, so they don't.
Okay.
It doesn't appear in the book as a sketch. I had found that must be within the archives. I'd have to look back to remember where exactly I had found that, but I don't think that appears in the book. No. The book,
thank you.
Excuse me. The things we see was really meant to be a sort of photographic record. That was the idea behind it. There's hardly any text. There's an introduction, but there's hardly any text in that series. It was meant to convey the meaning through a series of black and white photographs.
Yes, that's why I was just quite interested that there was also a sketch next to it. But I understand.
No, I put those two together. I'll have to retrace my steps there and think where I found that from.
Yeah, that would be really helpful if you could.
I will. Yeah, I will.
Thank you.
Virginia, thank you for this. I'll read out your comment there. I'm sure you can all read it for yourselves. The new store in Guildford comprised an existing building with an additional 5 floors added in the mid-1950s. It was managed by William Harvey, though I think actually owned by Army Navy. Harvey's then also owned Derry and Tom's, with its existing roof garden, probably the inspiration for having one in Guildford. Does that seem to make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes. And wasn't Marjorie Allen involved in a roof garden? Was it Selfridge's?
Anybody know the answer to that?
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yeah. So again, perhaps I don't know quite what time the Selfridge's was, whether it was after or before Harvey's. I have a feeling it might have been before.
Before.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe there was that connection as well.
Oh well, poor old Guildford. It's had its day in the sun. Sorry, that's very a negative of me. If other people have got questions, please do write them into the chat. But I would just like to hold it for a moment and ask one more question myself. Post-war Britain, science and discovery, travelling around Europe, travelling around the world. Obviously, there's a European influence on both their designs, but her planting design. Do you think that the beyond Europe travels also influenced her planting, her approach to a landscape?
Yes, I think she wrote several articles for the journal about her visits. There's a visit to India. Now she went to one of these with Sylvia Crowe and Brenda Colvin, I think. So it was stronger than just Europe, definitely. And she looked. I think there's an article about gardens in Japan as well. So it was widely cultural, wasn't it? I suppose. Shortly after the war, I think they were very impressed by what was happening in Europe, and particularly places like Sweden. I think they felt that that's where sort of really new ideas would come from. And then later, I mean, they were so good at really knowing people and getting to know people who were in the forefront of new garden development, especially American designers that they knew, and their work by Thomas Church featured in the Modern Private Gardens book. So it was a wide perspective, wasn't it? In Geoffrey's designs and then translating through to her planting.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sally, thank you so much from me, and I'll pass you over to Annabelle, if I may.
Thanks, Helen. Sally, that was fantastic. I think what you have done is shown why English Heritage made the wrong decision a few years ago of not having her name alongside Geoffrey Jellicoe's on the blue plaque. I think you've shown that she was, and I know, Helen, you said, oh, thank goodness you didn't mention Geoffrey, but I think, it's very hard not to think that they didn't bounce off each other in all sorts of ways. I think they were an incredible pair who really sort of changed the whole thing. And I think neither of them could have done it without the other, or, as much as they did. Thank you so much, Sally. That was fantastic. And I'm thrilled we've now got at last this talk recorded for many other people to listen to. So,
well, thank you, Annabelle, because it was actually, that's how I discovered the archive, wasn't it? All those years ago now, actually, coming to where the Institute was and meeting you and digging out those boxes, which then went through a period of being closed up and no one could see them. And then they went to the Garden Museum and now they're at Merle and now everyone can see them. So, thank you for the work that you've done in bringing that alive.
No. I mean, it was really interesting, actually, because Sheila, the librarian, was very, very closed about who could see. I didn't see the photos for years working there because they were in such a, fragile state.
Fragile, yeah.
But it was very funny. Thank you so much. Really brilliant. I hope everybody will unmute themselves and clap.